Well, I wanted to start by adding my gratitude for the welcome we've received on this land here in Ontario, but also across the country. As we know, Toronto has been, for thousands of years, been stewarded by a diversity of Indigenous nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Wendat peoples, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are thankful that we are given the opportunity to work, live, love, and worship on this land. I also want to acknowledge the relationship that has existed for generations between Indigenous communities and my people who are here in the Americas, including here in Canada, due to the transatlantic slave trade. Unlocking the potential of refugees and newcomers and migrants in Canada. Canada has the reputation of being a great place to live, raise their families, work, and grow their business. Every year, it is one of the top destinations in the world that immigrants look towards as their potential new home, encouraged by Canada's public policies in part. For example, our settlement and integration program objectives speak of integrating newcomers successfully so that Canada can realize the economic, social, cultural, and I will add, political benefits that they bring. And the federal government funds services and programs towards that goal, ranging from language training to activities that build social networks, to supporting the capacity enhancement of organizations that support immigrants and refugee settlement and integration. The question is it enough? Unfortunately for many newcomers, the Canadian dream is often deferred as they face increasing struggles and multiple barriers on their integration journey. Things like precarious work, the lack of affordable places for families, for people and their families to live, the daily fight for self-esteem as their worth as people are devalued in daily microaggressions, and the systemic discrimination often based on race, sexuality, gender identity, disability, name, even accent, and faith that many immigrants and refugees face in their everyday life. Within our service sector, there are increasing concerns about homo and transphobia, reinforcement of sexist assumptions about the roles that women play in the family and in society at large. All of these circumstances are outside of an individual's control, but they definitely determine the range of opportunities or lack of opportunities a person has access to in order to build a good life in Canada. Hence, I believe the main question is how to finally eradicate these external barriers and unlock the doors to opportunities for people who come here for various reasons in search of a better life. Immigrants have long factored into narratives of Canada's success and its image of itself as an inclusive, pluralist society that values multiculturalism and diversity. Now we need to walk the talk. I want to present 3 visions, and each vision has 1 or 2 recommendations. First vision, a safe place with access to services regardless of immigration status. Recommendation 1, and this is to our federal and provincial governments. Eliminate immigration detention with a priority to remove all children and their parents and guardians immediately from detention centers. What is the lock? Thank you. Canada does not impose a maximum time limit on immigration detention. In 2017, the Ontario Superior Court ordered the release of a West African immigration detainee held in maximum security jail for 7 years, including 103 consecutive days spent in solitary confinement. According to data provided by Canada Border Service Agency, 6,251 people were held in immigration detention in 2016-17, including 151 minors. Recommendation 2, again to the federal and provincial governments. Open up access to Canada Child Benefit Program so that all children resident in Canada, regardless of immigration status, may benefit. And specifically to the Ontario government, maintain the Transitional Child Benefit Program, which is a key financial support for refugee claimants or asylum seekers. Once again, the lock. The number of non-status people has grown largely due to unfair immigration and refugee law that deny legal status to many, including migrant workers, disproportionately workers of color from the global south, recruited for low-paid jobs and who, for a variety of reasons, fall out of status. Without status and despite paying taxes, sales tax, property tax through rents, they cannot work legally and are at higher risk of abuse and exploitation. Often, they do not seek police protection because of the fear of deportation, and this is especially troubling in the case of women experiencing intimate partner violence. They cannot access most programs and services. They are ineligible for services from our largest funder, IRCC. For example, Canadian-born children with parents with precarious immigration status are excluded from the Canada Child Benefit Program, one of our best, most forward-looking policy tool in our poverty elimination regime. That's a shame. Even when they have status in Canada, migrant workers are exceptionally susceptible to exploitation and abuse. Migrant workers who are injured on the job are indeed routinely sent back to their countries of origin, preventing them from accessing needed treatment which may not be available in their home countries, and the workers' compensation benefits to which they are entitled. In the last 5 years or so, the Canadian government has been proactive in its resettlement of individuals in need of protection because of sexual orientation and/or gender identity. Yet, racialized asylum seekers, refugee claimants in particular from countries in the global south, who claim persecution on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity are disadvantaged in the inland refugee determination process. Lawyers representing LGBTQ2S+ claimants have reported instances of clients being asked graphic and intrusive questions about sexual practices during hearings. These disadvantages are compounded by the frequent inadequacy of interpretation services. In Canada, refugee claimants, migrant workers, and undocumented people are overrepresented in poverty and are not eligible for federally funded settlement services, including language training. Paradoxically, they are the groups most in need of such support. Interpretation and translation services are limited and not available to access even basic services such as health and housing. Those with few financial resources often rely on children, family, friends, or acquaintances to interpret, even in circumstances that are confidential or sensitive. Family reunification is denied to many due to immigration rules that exclude siblings and extended families. And those living below the low-income cutoff or who are on social assistance are ineligible to sponsor parents and grandparents. These rules break or at least weaken family units. They put even more psychological and financial pressure on the anxious members in Canada. Vision 2. Recommendation 1, again, federal, provincial government, and municipal governments. Put pressure on various actors, including regulatory bodies, post-secondary institutions, and employers to finally recognize international credentials. One of the paradoxes of Canada's immigration program is to attract new immigrants to help them integrate into the labor market. Unfortunately, immigrants face growing underemployment as immigrants with post-secondary degrees are often working jobs that do not require higher education. A great deal of evidence points to a lack of recognition of foreign-gained experience and credentials outside of Western context as a contributing factor to under- and unemployment. This has occurred despite the higher education levels required resulting from changes in Canada's immigration selection strategy towards a human capital model, which is designed to select immigrants based on education and skills levels best thought to meet the needs of our labor markets. The fact that immigrants' credentials and work experience are often undervalued or devalued explains why 41% of chronically poor immigrants have post-secondary degrees. Recommendation 2, reopen the Federal Employment Equity Act to include immigrants as a recognized group in the act and extend its reach to non-federally regulated sectors. Tie transfer payments to provinces to their establishment of employment equity regimes. What's the lock? Overall, the lack of recognition for non-Western credentials and experience is also connected to the issue of racialization. Indeed, evidence points towards a color-coded labor market that is segmented based on ethno-racial characteristics, where systemic barriers, including discriminatory attitudes and behavior, make it more difficult for racialized immigrants to get stable jobs that pay good wages. For example, people of color living in Ontario have higher unemployment rates than white residents. Racialized men are 24% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized men. Racialized women are 43% more likely to be unemployed than non-racialized women. Multiple studies have demonstrated that employers discriminate against job applicants with African, Asian, or Muslim-sounding names, even when applicants have equivalent education and experience. The same bias gets expressed based on one's neighborhood of residence, as indicated by one's postal code. Employers' use of police record checks in the hiring process entrenches the exclusion of over-policed Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color from the labor market. Several studies suggest that discrimination in the labor force, higher unemployment rates, more insecure and precarious employment, and lower wages and earnings are significant contributors to the growing number of racialized families living in poverty. There are significant racialized wage and employment gaps in Canada. In 2015, long-standing immigrants had an average income similar to or lower than the Canadian-born population in 1980. The average income of long-standing immigrants of color has not increased in 35 years, in contrast to the increases seen for the Canadian-born population. Recent immigrants had a low income rate of 34.4%, which was more than twice the rate of 12.5% for non-immigrants. And of course, racialized immigrants are most likely to experience the highest low income rates. Vision number 3, a place called home. Federal and provincial governments and municipal governments ensure a comprehensive housing strategy that invests in building affordable, adequate-sized rental units, prioritize refugees, including refugee claimants, for social and supportive housing. I am hoping there are City of Toronto folks in the room. Housing is another key area for settlement and resettlement. Unfortunately, the barriers here are strong. Primary destinations for immigrants and refugees are often large urban centers. Just over 50% of people of color households in Canada live in homes which are not affordable, leading to hidden homelessness, that are inadequate, often requiring repairs or maintenance, and unsuitable, meaning that they're overcrowded, among other issues. This compares to 28% for non-racialized households. Despite the poor housing conditions, one study found that most immigrants were spending more than 50% of their income on housing, with 15% spending 75% or more on their home. In Ontario, we call that deep homelessness. In addition to poor housing conditions, Indigenous peoples, peoples of color, and immigrants face discrimination on the basis of source of income, credit history, access to guarantors and references, racial identity, immigration status, gender, and age. Recommendations, the second recommendation, enforce the Residential Tenancy Act. Increasing the enforcement of the Residential Tenancy Act would address many of the conditions and barriers that women, immigrants, and refugees face in the private rental housing market as a result of discrimination. A better enforcement of the Residential Tenancy Act would deter many private landlords from refusing to rent to refugees and refugee claimants, immigrants, and women-headed households. Recommendation 4, and these are for service providers. Foster strategic relationships with landlords. Given the limited housing supply, shift focus from subsidized housing to building and developing relationships with private market household rentals. Funding recommendations before I end in 54 seconds.
No, that's you're over by 56 seconds.
Oh, I am almost done. I have to say funding. Reestablish IRCC funding for ethno-racial centered organizations. Let me say that again. For those of you in the room who have focused on ethno-racial communities, reestablish IRCC funding for ethno-specific organizations. Review and revise funding to women's-specific organizations. Increase funding for women's organizations, particularly those working with marginalized women. Fund collaboration in addition to local immigration partnerships among sector organizations. Cross-sectoral recommendations. More administrative data sharing for better understanding of newcomers, refugees, and migrant workers' pathways. Collection and reporting out of disaggregated data on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, including gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, and faith. Raise public awareness, and it was great to hear Fraser speak to this. Raise public awareness about mutual benefit of immigration and community inclusiveness, and implement the National Anti-Racism Strategy and Action Plan. In conclusion, we know that there is much work still to do as we build an inclusive and welcoming Canada. When I look around and I see a room full of champions, human rights and social justice warriors, to reclaim that term. We all have a role to play in creating a Canada we envision, a Canada that is inclusive of all and that ensures equality of opportunity and equitable life outcomes, a Canada where you and I and all newcomers can thrive. And thank you for the additional 2 minutes.